Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I am Daniela Bleichmer, Director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities, and we are here today for one of our monthly book chats where we celebrate and discuss a recent publication by a USC author. We ask that if possible you turn on your camera. It is always nicer to be together, even in this form, when we can see each other. Today, we are discussing Cavan Concannon's recent publication, Profaning Paul, just out from the University of Chicago Press a few months ago, late 2021. Joining us today for this conversation are Richard Newton, Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Alabama, and Jorunn Auckland, Professor of Interdisciplinary Gender Studies at the University of Oslo and Director of the Norwegian Institute at Athens. And the conversation will be moderated by Kelsey Moss, Assistant Professor of Religion at USC. Our format is we will very quickly hear from Cavan about the book, and then Professors Newton and Auckland will engage him in a conversation about the book, and then about maybe 12:40 we will open it up for questions. So welcome, thank you so much for joining us. And Cavan, you are first. You will need to unmute.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniela. Thank you all for being here. I thought I would just sort of take the first few minutes and just kind of summarize the book so that we don't all have to feel like we've read everything to be here. So this is a book that came out of a period of frustration with how people talked about Paul and in New Testament studies and beyond. And it also came out of a long engagement that I've had since graduate school with a tradition of what I would basically call like neo-Marxist philosophers in Europe, who were appropriating Paul for their own projects in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s, and a conversation that emerged around that. And as I put off writing the book to engage with some of these questions, I was really initially really animated by how Paul was being conscripted into these sort of really interesting political configurations, but grew relatively frustrated with the way in which that conversation unfolded. And so I put off writing about this and wanted to kind of sit with it. And what happened was that I sat with it and read all of these guys' other work and kind of engaged with that, and began to see that there were kind of places where I wanted to engage the question differently, and this book emerges from that. And it felt to me like a project that needed doing, but it also needed to address the fact that I was situated within New Testament studies or biblical studies, and to kind of interrogate that as well. And so what I wanted to do was try to figure out, well, what would happen if we fully tried to address the way in which Paul, as this sacred figure in Western history, was always already within a framework for interpretation. I learned a lot from working through the work of Vincent Wimbush, who helps me to help me kind of rethink what it meant to study scriptures within a context of scripturalization, how they are rendered scriptural. And that framework allowed me to both come at take a different kind of critical vantage point than I'd had before on my own field and its own inscription in a kind of white colonial knowledge production regime. One of the chapters in the book tries to get at that. But it also got me thinking about sort of how one might dislodge Paul from that framework and take a different view on him. And it occurred to me along the process as I was working on this project that a framework of thinking about garbage, excrement, and refuse would be a way to think about what it would take to profane Paul, to kind of take him out of this framework of the sacred, in which he's always interpretable, always legible, always able to be in a position to be redeemed for new projects, and to think about what it would look like to really profane Paul. And the most profane thing I could think of was excrement and garbage. And along the way, I found, to my enjoyment, that there's a whole field of study of garbology and trash and shit studies. And so that brought me into a whole different series of discourses that really, I think, helped me to come back to the things that I study and look at them differently. And along the way, I kind of tried to mobilize a series of alternative voices. I particularly like Sheila Briggs, who's my colleague here at USC, who is in the room with us. And so thinking with her work, as well as other scholars in my orbit, who I think would end up being more interesting interlocutors with the people who have kind of tried to turn Paul into a philosophical Marxist hero. And that kind of turning away from that framing, breaking Paul out of his position within the kind of Western canon, creates the space for engaging with his texts in different ways. And so I look to other traditions that are not the kind of white male stream of the guild to think about who might be different conversation partners, and thus who might actually animate and inform the projects of these sort of Marxist intellectuals in ways that would take them in more interesting and perhaps more useful directions than if they are just kind of continuing this sort of like, let's just talk about as like privileged white guys with each other all the time. And the goal of the project was to kind of bring together a different assortment of readers and thinkers. And along the way, it felt to me also important to include aspects of my own biography in that conversation, so that people would have a sense of where I was coming from and to kind of position myself in the field a little bit more. And so I have kind of included these various excursions that run throughout the book as an attempt to kind of bring myself and interrogate my own history and my own position in the field at the same time. So the book takes us on a journey through kind of a history of shit, a history of the shittiness of my field, sanitation work that my field does. And then we turn to attempts by people both inside my guild and outside of my guild to redeem Paul in various ways, whether that is by splitting him in half and finding the good guy versus the bad guy, or whether it means talking about the conspiracy of the Paul that was lost to the history of the West by the church or some other kind of conspiracy. And then I turn to other voices, other readers of Paul, enslaved Africans, as well as womanist and queer biblical scholars, to think about how we might approach Paul's archive in a different way, and kind of bringing this all together in a framework of what happens if we treat Paul as shit, we treat his archive as shit, which brings forth certain kinds of fecund possibilities, while also shutting down other avenues that have been traditionally trafficked in our field. So that's the attempt to do this book. And it's a weird book, I will grant that, but it was fun to write, and it's been fun to talk about since, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you all think about it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cavan. And I can personally say how excited I am seeing some of this earlier stages of this to now have it in my hands. So I'm excited to talk about it today. Let's just dive right in, and we'll turn it over to, I think, Richard first, and then to John.
You mentioned it was a fun book to write. It was certainly a fun book to read. I mean, as harrowing as much of what you discuss is, it was also so refreshing to read a book about shit that gives us space to breathe and consider and ponder too. And as you're thinking about sort of scripturalization and how Paul gets taken into some of these kind of Marxist, neo-Marxist philosophical discourses, and how you want to remind us of the need to interpret the text that's not self-interpreted by any means. I was really fascinated by how you would frame Paul's writings, or the Pauline tradition, as an archive. And I wonder if you had all struggled with how you would sort of frame our data for thinking about this, or was archive just the best word that you thought would be useful? Or are there synonyms that you explored as well? Because I think, especially for those who come from like ecclesial settings, I don't know how much they would jump to the term archive to think about a series or set of texts?
Yeah. I struggled with that because I think part of what happened is that I started out by writing about Paul, and the thing is that like that in my head, like there's my historian brain started to kind of like trip over that over and over again, because like, well, I'm not really talking about Paul, a person. Nor am I really talking about Paul, like this figure that I'm reconstructing. I'm wanting to talk about kind of Paul as this set of stuff it's a mixture of like a historical person and a set of texts and a memory of Paul as a character in various legendary stories, and Paul as a kind of force that kind of works its way in different combinations through history. And it occurred to me that archive was sort of I think where this came from is that when I was teaching at Duke, my colleague David Morgan had written a lot about sort of how the kind of white European image of Jesus is like so common for people. Like we think of Jesus and we think of that like Werner Salman portrait of the head of Christ, and he was trying to discuss, like he used the word archive to think about like the archive of our memories of what Jesus looked like, and that kind of struck. I think that's what I carried into this project, was thinking about sort of like what's the kind of summative, image of Paul over time that has built up, and it's not Paul as a person; it's Paul as a kind of it's a library full of Paul's stuff, and that's the thing that I wanted to get at, because I don't think I really have access to Paul as a person, and the historical Paul is his own kind of project of modernity. And so, the fact is that regardless of whatever I say about Paul, that doesn't change the fact that the stuff that is part of that archive of Paul has done all sorts of things. Like I can't undo the doing of that. And so, archive to me seemed like the best way to kind of capture the complexity of that term that I kept stumbling over. Yeah.
For me, the term archive is so familiar, I guess, because I'm familiar with much of this European tradition the continental tradition that you were referring to, and there you have archive all over the place, and that to me that also signifies that there is not so much expectation about a consistent author in a way. It is these philosophers the contemporary philosophers, they are rereading both each other's work, but also the work of the previous one. So it's much more seen as books and not particularly persons. And I wonder if this is something that is slightly different with Paul as archive, because when you take an author that belongs to the Christian Bible, there is much more of this kind of, I don't know, maybe a pious need to connect with the author in a different way that certainly a few of my colleagues in philosophy would need to connect personally with the Geist of Immanuel Kant or something like this. Mm-hmm. So archive is a more kind of neutral term that certainly that's what it signifies for me. But I just loved reading this book because it's so immensely well written. And maybe since I'm not a native speaker of English, it's such a great pleasure to read something that is so well written. And a lot of biblical scholars whose native language is English don't put any work into actually writing well. So I get so happy when people put a lot of work into the actual text, like producing such a great text to read. And there were so many quotations I could make that they're so brilliant. So I just had to pick out one. When you said this, I don't have the page here, but you said at some point, for Badiou, Paul is a surprising and valuable discovery as he scours the garbage heaps of the Western tradition, looking for a replacement of Lenin. And I think this also for me illustrates something important about scholarly writing, and that, we think that, well, we are right scholarly way, so all of this aesthetical approach doesn't, it's unnecessary frills. But I think that in that one sentence, you are able to say so much more because of the way the sentence is layered and phrased and added. And this is just a great example of how you can say very, very much in one sentence if you just think really carefully about how to phrase it. So, this was just one example. The book is full of such sentences. So those of you who haven't read it should certainly look for those gems. And I also thought that the autobiographical sections, the way it blended into the other sections really worked well, because it's that can work or cannot work. But I felt that you were kind of you were using this very, it was very pointed towards the topics that you want to explore in this book. And I really felt that worked very well too. I would just like to kind of ask some questions, because from the book's descriptions that I had seen before I received it, I thought it was a book about Pauline scatology, so to say, considering Paul from the bottom of the public toilets along the Lechayan road in Corinth, much like Tina Pippin has addressed the New Jerusalem, described in the book of Revelation, from the bottom of the abominable bottomless pit, mentioned in the book of Revelation too, and how it looks different from there. And I thought that, well, that is a great project, and I only later realized that that's not really what it was about, except from your discussion of Philippians. Because you have been working on archaeology too, haven't you? Yeah, because I guess it was from the Handbook of Pauline Studies where you wrote the archaeology chapter. So I guess this is why I thought that this is what the book would be about. But how I would just like curious how much your background from excavating in Corinth and elsewhere, how important has that been for your thinking about these issues and the production of, or the writing of this book? Because it's, maybe it was just me that kind of heard it against that background, but there is some of it in there, and I don't think you could have written this book without that background. But on the other hand, you haven't really elaborated a lot on it in this book. Yeah,
I mean, I think it's very true. I mean, I love Roman toilets. I love Roman sewers. I just find that stuff super fascinating, and I don't think, I mean, it's entirely possible that there will be, something that's like something a little bit more like that in the future. I mean, I think that what archaeology and doing archaeological work and really thinking with archaeological materials like gave me an attentiveness to, I mean, archaeology is this sort of destructive project where you dig through the layers of human settlement and you rip them up and you think about what was discarded, and you use the discarded elements of what people left behind, either intentionally or accidentally in the course of their living someplace. And that discarded material becomes the stuff that helps us to know what we think we know about an ancient place. And so it has certainly become clear to me that, like, what historians do that are attentive to the materiality of the worlds in which we study, we are studying the things that are thrown away and left out and left behind. And I think that did give me a kind of attentiveness to that aspect of our work. And I wanted to kind of think a little bit more expansively about that, not only as a kind of window onto the ancient world, but as to a kind of a window onto the production, like how modern academia produces knowledge. And I think that, like, the separating those two out is something that our field does as a way of maintaining a certain kind of white male hegemony over the center. We kind of put all of our work back there, and we don't address it to the here or to the even in the intervening period from how we got from there to here. And I think that there was a weird kind of way in which that optic starts to kind of fold it back on me and how I felt about my own formation and the field in which I operate. And I wanted to kind of turn that archaeological, scatological set of interests back on myself and the people around me. And I thought that was, I certainly think that archaeology has attuned me to things that I wouldn't have been attuned to if I'd just been sitting with like my literary texts, trying to interpret them as best I could. And there's something about that, I don't know, getting into the dirt that has changed me as a biblical scholar. And that, yeah, it's very much in there. And it's one of those things that, like, writing this book, I'm now working on another book on ancient Christian networks. And writing the book actually has totally changed how I'm going to talk about those ancient networks, because I'm less convinced of that the project is actually excavating first century things with our work, and that more about this sort of, that we should be doing scripturalization, but in antiquity, and thinking about how memories of Paul are constructed over the course of centuries, and you turning our attention to sort of a kind of more engaged way of doing that is what I think this book has taught me to do as someone who's going to now turn back in some ways to working on antiquity as opposed to just working in the present. So I have another book coming out on a present set of issues, but yeah.
I wanted to quickly circle back and give you a chance to reflect, if you want, Cavan, on the amazing compliments that you were just given, but specifically around your writing process. They were well-written, well-crafted prose. It wasn't impeccable how you layered the theory, your commitment to the shit and the garbage metaphor you sustained all the way throughout, and this autobiographical element, like weaving all of that together so masterfully. I just wanted to give you a chance to reflect, because I thought that was one of the most beautiful parts of the text. And then if Richard wants to jump back in with other thoughts and questions.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I have a hard time taking compliments. I'm not good at, but thank you. It's like hard to, and it's really gratifying to hear that. I mean, in the writing process, I wrote the book kind of in like the first draft of it kind of came out really fast. Like I think I'd bottled up a lot of my thoughts on this for a long time, and it just kind of came out really quickly. And then eventually I worked on it, and I presented a draft of it to our manuscript review group here at USC. And one of the things that happened in the discussion in that manuscript review is that, like, people, Jenny Knust, who teaches at Duke, who was one of the people who we invited to be part of that, just asked me, like, I need to know, just said straight up, I need to know more about where you're coming from, because I wasn't in the book. And so I talked a little bit about, like, where in that session about where I felt like my biography intersected with this book, and people thought I got the sense that was helpful. And I talked to Jenny about it afterwards, and she suggested that, like, I need to be able to trust you, to be able to trust that that what you're telling me is, I need to know you're in it too, and it got me I kind of hunted around, because I don't like the kind of intro. I think you gestured this. Sometimes you can do the positioning where you're just like, I'm going to check off all the boxes of, like, I am a white cis hetero man, and I could do that, and there's something important about doing that, but I think that, like, it's more interesting to try to think about, like, how do I reveal something about myself that is in service to the argument, rather than merely kind of like I'm going to put it up at the beginning, and then we'll pretend like I can just keep going on with business as usual because I did the thing I'm supposed to do. And so it felt to me like the best way to do that was to pick some vignettes from my life to think about, like, how they could advance the argument itself. And so that took a lot of work, took a lot of refining, and it went through a lot of drafts. And I will give total credit to my partner, Julie Skeeton, who was an amazing partner, but also editor. So she also helped me to find a little bit more, better turns of phrase here at various points. And the editors at Chicago also like took out some of my more, I don't know, egregious puns on the scatological. So that was also probably good of them to do. So there were a couple ones that I worked out with one of my friends here at USC that got a little bit too far. They went a little bit, like I went to eschatological at one point, which is just, that was like too much, and no, it was not necessary. But so that's, Fred Clark deserves all the credit for eschatological. Yeah, so that was the process. It just took a lot of refining, and I just really wanted to commit to it. I wanted to commit to writing something that was accessible, and part of it too was that I enjoy reading all these people like Badiou and Agamben. I find their work interesting, but I also find it's really hard to read because they are not generally expert craftspeople at writing. They're conveying complicated ideas, and I really wanted to write something that talked about something as sophisticated as what they're trying to get across, but in a way that somebody could actually understand on a first read. So I really wanted to be able to do that too. So that took a lot of, the Badiou section in particular went through 10 or 12 different kind of iterations to kind of pare it down to something that could be legible, because it's a lot going on that was initially in my head, and I had to kind of unpack a lot of things. And so just wanted to kind of commit to the revisions of it. Yeah.
Richard, did you have other thoughts?
I think one thing that was really compelling for me as you were integrating or really giving space to your biography, not as a series of checkboxes, but sort of places of tension or attention for in which we can inhabit as readers with you, is the attention to the fact that on one hand, you're bringing in a number of tools, either that you already had at your disposal to do this kind of scholarly work, or that were new to you tools that you were doing as you were moving away from certain places and positions and centerings about interpretation. And then also finding certain questions and ideas that you could kind of do away with at this point, like who was the historical Paul? Did Paul think this or care about that? What did Paul eat to? What did Paul do? And what have people done with Paul? And where else might I pay attention to? Who are the other conversation partners that would be worth an ear or a read? As you're going through this, it challenged me, and I suspect will challenge readers to also think in those expansive terms, and finding different conversation partners. And one conversation partner that I kept coming back to, interestingly enough, was Kanye West, as I was reading your book. And you don't mention, but Kanye West did an album called Life of Pablo. Mm-hmm. And I guess he expounded upon this album, I think I think it was an interview with a Kardashian, I think Khloe Kardashian. I'm not up on my Kardashians, but I think this is the source. And the conversation was around sort of who is Pablo. And at one point he talks about Pablo Escobar as being a sort of a mover of product, and Pablo Picasso as a mover of art, and then Paul, or Saint Paul, I guess he calls him, as the strongest influencer of Christianity. And that like sort of all three play into this kind of matrix of Paul and Pablo that he is trying to embody with his craft, with Kanye's own craft. And as I was thinking about Paul and Paul's own shit and Kanye West and his own shit, and how people like to shit on both of those guys, like how do you I wonder how you sort of respond to those, to the epistles of Paul, or Paul's archive, according to Kanye.
Oh man, this is one of those things where like, I know that it would be super interesting to sit with Kanye's sort of like persona now and his archive and play with it. Cause I remember when he tweeted the Paul reference, and I ended up using it like in a slide once in a class right after it happened. And like the kind of play with Pablo and Paul, and I know he's got this sort of really complicated, weird relationship with Christianity, and he's running Sunday services now where people wear like burlap sacks. I mean, like I think there's something happening there, and I really want to analyze it, and I just haven't done it yet. But I think, man, would be fascinating. If you ever want to work on something together, I would totally be into that. Because I find his, yeah, I found him fascinating. I've found the kind of weird misogyny and kind of like mental health stuff that seems to have followed him around to be concerning. But I've certainly found his music and his production work to be really interesting. He seems to live in a set of contradictions that I find inscrutable, but that just means I haven't taken the time to really dig into it.
Yeah, because like as I was reading this, I was thinking about my own training too in New Testament studies, and thinking about like, why not Jesus? Why not Peter? Right? Like if you're going to pick your focus in the study, biblical studies, and mark out your own scholarly territory, right? There's sort of like, who are you studying and what passages and what books and what moments? And, I was thinking, okay, so why not Jesus? Why not Peter? But then also putting Paul, like, profaning Paul, right? And putting him next to Picasso and Escobar opens up an interesting lens of analysis, and got me thinking as I was reading your book, what kind of assumptions go into and privileges go into our training when we think about who's properly juxtaposed to Paul. And it seems like Badu and some of these others have a certain training that leads them to sanctify Paul in a certain space next to certain people. Kanye in a set, certainly me as a New Testament scholar, sometimes with another set. And sort of just, it was fascinating how your book, as you have us sit in a Corinthian toilet, has us reflect back, looking at a mirror darkly. So.
No, I mean, I love that, because part of where this book came from was because I just was reading Badu, and I was reading Zizek and Agamben and all these guys. And there was something about me in the late 90s, early 2000s that was just in that conversation, and really started to read it, and actually thought I was going to write my dissertation on it initially. And then I kind of lost that focus, but I never lost that conversation. And I was reading those guys over the last 20 years, just my head was there. And so that's part of why they're in this book. I mean, they wrote books on Paul, they talked about him a lot, they used him in their projects. And I felt like they could have done something different. And I wanted to show how that could happen. But I also don't think that just because they're, famous white guy philosophers in Europe, that's why that we should put them with Paul. And I think it would be super cool I think it'd be really cool to read Paul with Kanye, and to read Paul with these other forces that scripturalize him. I'm thinking also I found myself having coffee outside Justin Bieber's church the other day, and I didn't realize it until I saw all the really nicely dressed people coming out of the service while I was sipping coffee, and thought, what is this church? And it turned out to be like Justin Bieber's church. And I'm thinking, there's a whole pop cultural world that uses the stuff that we use. And this is maybe a question I can ask to you, because you've done that. You went from training as a New Testament scholar to writing your first book on roots as an American set of scriptures. So you also thought outside of the box of how do I take a biblical text and put it in the past, and the bigger questions of how do we think about texts operating in a contemporary context. So I'm curious, maybe I will turn that question your direction. How did you kind of work your brain out of the New Testament training framework?
So very quickly, I want to give you a chance to respond, Richard, and then Joran, if you have one last comment or question, and then we want to make sure we leave it open for the comments of our audience. Richard, you can quickly answer that.
Well, I think for me, it was wrestling with something Joran said early on about consistency, and how people approach a text if it's consistently present and important, and remembering that that's a weird thing. That's never how texts work. It's the work that we do to ourselves to approach text, that we say, oh yeah, this was stable, it's always been here, it comes from afar and comes to us and has something to say. As opposed to, yes, it's messy, and there are hands behind this that are messy, and there's ink and blood that's been spilled all around this stuff. And I wanted to sort of get back to the 19 where I didn't take that for granted, I guess. And the best way for me to do that was with a place where I was very, not necessarily familiar myself, but where I saw that happening a lot for people, and that there are consequences if I didn't follow along and figure out what they knew. And that's what I think is so interesting about the Pauline archive, right? Is that it doesn't require us to, it requires us to sit with those tensions of consistency of the reader and also of the text that we read. So,
Thank you.
In a nutshell.
I had further questions about ecology in particular. Again, for these two alternative layers, the material layer of ancient scatology, and also the various modern questions that you bring this into, and lots of questions that I appreciate are probably more burning in the US, but you know, over here you can't think about anything without thinking about ecology, and so I think that the step for, you know, for the shit being very, very generative for new life would have been a much stronger component of your book if you had written it from here. And the other thing is like why what you two just discussed, like why Paul and why not, you know, Jesus or some of the others. And I think this is because Jesus is already kind of described and filled in, his personality is filled in and in a narrative way in the Gospels, so it's more difficult. And you have these saint legends in a way about Jesus. Paul is more, you know, we only know him through his letters when he writes. There is not like a biography of Paul in the letters. So it's easier to kind of fill in the gaps, but also I think it's what you do, and what I found extremely helpful is that you see, you show how, you know, not only the old kind of Orthodox theologians and pious preachers, but even the modern Marxist philosophers leave in their wake a lot of waste that people can always kind of come back to Paul with. So like if we present a women-friendly Paul or a radical Paul for the poor people, there will always be something that's left out. It's like, yeah, but what about what he says there? And, you know, well, he's so women friendly. Why does he say that women should shut up? And why, you know, it's like, and using the garbage to show this, I felt was a very good grasp of kind of why this problem is never going away, because the garbage never goes away.
Right. No, I totally take that. I mean, every interpretation is always leaves something out. There's always a reminder, and so, you know, these quests to kind of, and it's you know, and it wouldn't be such a big problem to have a remainder left over from one's interpretation if it wasn't so important that, like, you make Paul do this thing so that you can argue for this, and then you're like, that's supposed to then be like what, you know, what the sacred text says you're going to do. So you make a kind of pro women's rights Paul, and then he goes over here and like, now you're going to charge ahead with this, but then there's all this other stuff that sometimes you have to do all this like anti-Judaism to make Paul pro women. I mean, there's all sorts, or sometimes you leave out stuff that's just still there, and anyone can just be like, well, but that's right there. And so, like, you know, and if Paul didn't have to be the person that wherein people anchored their politics, then and the focus was on like how interesting of an interpretation the interpreter made. If we focus on how the interpreter does this creative work of engaging with the text, reading it in different ways, and evaluated whether we think that that work is valuable as a spur to philosophical, theological, political thinking, rather than whether or not that person got Paul right or not. I think that would be a much more interesting position. And this is where like the Black interpretive tradition in the United States, to me, is so much more interesting. to foreground, because people, these are people for whom they say, well, we need to make this set of text work for us. And that's the most important piece of that. It's not so much whether we get the text right or wrong, we can engage with it, but the point is to kind of think about it as what's going to work, and to foreground that creative work, and to sort of, there's something to me that's lost when one says that like this, the work of kind of creating an anti-slavery Bible, like that, something's lost when we say that that's what the Bible really says, rather than like, this is the work that people did to make that happen, to make that be the default interpretive mode, to make that be how people think about these issues, to draw ethical attention to this problem, and to rethink the scriptural tradition to do that. I think that's more valuable than, and there's something lost in that when we say, well, that's just the result of someone finding what the Bible really says, or what Paul really said. I want to give the interpreter that space to be the person who leads us into something more interesting than what was there before.
Thank you, Cavan, and thank you, Joran and Richard. So at this point, we want to open it up. So please, if you have comments, questions for Cavan, or just for the room, please, you can raise your Zoom hand and jump in. And we'll try to keep that going as efficiently as possible in our last 15 minutes here. So is there anyone that wants to get us started off? Yes, Jessica.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much, Cavan. It's a treat to hear you speak more about the book. And it's sort of, as I think others have mentioned, I think Kelsey, you said, I read that initial draft for the manuscript workshop, and it's really wonderful to see how it's evolved. But I actually wanted to ask you more about your decision to put in autobiographical matter and to situate yourself. And I guess I wanted to ask you to speak, maybe if you're willing, a little bit more programmatically, because I think this is something that a lot of scholars struggle with, the whether to, how and whether and to what extent to situate ourselves in our own work. And it's something of a disciplinary thing, right? I mean, anthropologists do it all the time. It's like, it's like a no-brainer, like obviously you have to do that. Historians almost never do it. It's like very weird for a historian to do it. I think religion scholars are kind of somewhere in between, but I'm curious if you have thoughts, having now been brave and done it. Do you think it should happen more? Do you think it happens too much? Do you think it depends? How do we, because really this is this deeper question about how do we deal with this sort of postmodern moment where we recognize that scholarship isn't about finding some objective truth. And yet at some level, we're always a little bit committed to this question of standards and objectivity and neutrality.
I think, and thank you for that question, Jessica. I think that what drove me, like in my first two books, I didn't put myself into it. I mean, I put some thoughts at the beginning, the beginning and the end, maybe some interesting takeaways from what I was, like I didn't put myself into the writing of those first two books. And I think I didn't know how to do it, precisely because I think I was sort of trained that, in a way that, I wanted to kind of have an ethically oriented set of historiographical approaches, and I wanted to put those in there. I wanted to put the ethics in there, but I didn't want to put myself in there because I was still kind of clinging to some kind of like, I'm still a little bit detached from this. I think that what was important to me was that at that point, I didn't think I knew how to write myself in a way that wasn't just perfunctory. And I think that there's a lot of ways. I mean, I think maybe this is maybe like my kind of Marxist framing of things, is that I think that there's a lot of ways in which capitalism is really good at co-opting like things that are politically fraught for capitalism. And I think that one of the ways that I can see that happening is this sort of like way in which, well, postmodernism and this turn to sort of position situated and locally situated optics can easily co-opt that into a kind of like, well, you just kind of have to fill out your form and you just put that there, and then you can just keep doing whatever you want to do. Like we just do it same as usual, and it's just different because I set my position. And I wanted to to think about like, I wanted to go beyond, like, it's not a box to check. I know Danielle had to click in the chat a moment. It's not like a box to check. It's that I wanted to actually put something about myself that mattered to the argument, and that was sort of like showed how I was embedded in it, and to risk that as opposed to just doing the thing that felt kind of safe. And the thing is that like, I just don't know if the box checking does more than check boxes. And it gets at a question of sort of representation overall. Like, representation is important, but representation also has to bring with it a change of how we do what we do. Like, the system has to change. Otherwise, we're just replicating whiteness in a different way. And so, I don't know, to me, the goal was to do something that was risky and a little vulnerable, and that actually did some work, as opposed to just saying, I know who I am, and now you can feel comfortable reading this book because I said what I'm supposed to say I am, you know. That's programmatically, I don't know how to tell people how to do that. I mean, I think I learned to do that from reading a lot of work that's done in queer studies, like Eve Sedgwick and Svetkovich, and people like that have found ways to braid their personal narratives in with their like philosophical theoretical work. And I found that to be, and usually they do it in the service of like, how do we show you something else about the thing that we're talking about. So that was kind of an inspiration to me as well.
Thank you both. Other comments and questions? David, looking forward to getting the book. Yes, Daniela.
I mean, I have questions. As a total outsider, I will say that it's not often that I read a book so far afield from what I do and find so much that is not only fascinating, but I feel I can directly take to my own work. So it was not only super fun to read. And as I told Cavan, the only time in my entire life I have felt compelled to bring an academic book to the dinner table and read aloud the table of contents so that my children could laugh and laugh and laugh at, you know, the number of times I said the word shit. So never have I had that experience before. I don't know that I'll ever have it again. I thought that both Richard and Jorun made comments that were very helpful for me in understanding your book. And one was about the tension, if we want to call it that, between shit and garbage and the sort of environmental in this. You do end with this idea of composting, but I was wondering if you wanted to think a bit more about sort of what ecology offers to eschatology. The other question was about the archive, because as a historian, as you know, I care a lot about the idea of the archive and what the archive makes possible. And it's something that has sort of erupted from history to many, many other places in this archival moment. And I was thinking that if this book had been published maybe 20 years ago, it would have been discourse rather than archive. And I was wondering if that is something that helps you or that invites you to talk about the work that the idea of an archive does for you versus a discourse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I certainly like Foucault's like discourse framework, like framing of things as kind of discursive, was really formative for me in finding kind of alongside kind of my training in feminist biblical criticism, is kind of taking a kind of outsider look at how these systems operate. And I think archive just feels, this gets to Jorun's point that, there's something kind of also like archaeological about the archive. Like it's like objects, and a lot of my work has turned around kind of engaging with objects and with archaeological materials and engaging with the kind of the juxtaposition between the literary and the material, and thinking through those things. So archive just feels right to me. I mean, I was part of a small kind of academic event at the Santa Barbara mission around the time that I was working on this book, where we were talking about the archive of ancient texts that were preserved in this mission's library, like copies of the Aeneid, copies of the Bible, as part of this colonial project of knowledge production. And I think there was something also that sparked my attention there to kind of the archive as a frame of thinking. When it comes to the ecology part, I was going to write another chapter, it just didn't come together the right way, because there's this passage in Romans where Paul talks about that, like, the world is in birth pangs, like that the world is about to be transformed into something different. The kind of eschatological moment is going to lead to the transformation of the world, and that imagery to me was going to be another chapter about an alternative ecology, that, like, in some ways Paul's archive feeds into a narrative that runs counter to the kinds of ecological projects that would allow us to think about how to live in the world. And that's something that we have to figure out how to do. We have to figure out how to, like, live in a world where our conceptual frames of the world actually land on the world as it is. This is like a phrase that I get from, like, Bruno Latour's work on ecological politics, where, like, we have to have a politics that can land. And Paul's eschatology envisions a world that will be transformed into something different, that is going to be just kind of done by God, and it will be done in this sort of eschatological thing, and it will involve the transformation of bodies out of these material psychical bodies into spiritual bodies. And this sort of desire for a kind of disembodied glorification, I think, runs counter to what would be necessary to forge a kind of really ecological theology. And there are people that do that work, that kind of do eco-theology, and they don't, I mean, some of them try to kind of, there's a book that I had on my bookshelf for a while called Greening Paul, which just, but anyway, so, like, mostly they don't use Paul to do that work. And so there is at some point probably bubbling up in me a kind of eco-theology that is shitting on Paul, like, kind of it's like something or other that may turn out somewhere, but that was in my head, and I just couldn't find the right way to bring it into this book, and it just didn't fit. Sometimes you have all that stuff that you want to talk about, and you have all these ideas, and you work it out for a while, and it just doesn't fit in the place. And I've been at this long enough to where I know that eventually that stuff finds another way out, and so it probably will find another way out. As long as that Greening Paul book sits on my bookshelf and taunts me, it's going to eventually have to find an outlet. Pauline studies makes me so mad so often that I just feel like, that anger bubbles up, and then it just has to come out, and that's never going to stop, probably.
So thank you, Cavan. I just a final question, and your answer just hinted at it, but any summarizing thoughts on where else you or how you would encourage others to go from here, if they were to follow your lead and profane Paul, kind of summarizing the work of some of these other interlocutors and voices that you bring in, like Nancy Ambrose and the enslaved interpreters of the Bible? Like, what would a future with a profaned Paul look like for you or for others?
So this is a great question, and I love that question. I think this is where, I mean, I'm right, Richard, that wasn't Vincent Wimbush your advisor? Was he part of your committee? Am I right about that? Yeah. So, like, I think that Vincent Wimbush is pointing us in a direction that I tried to follow a little bit in this book, but I think is the right direction, which is to say that biblical scholarship, I think we need to give up, not totally, but at least in some of our focus on a quest for origins. And I think we need to be thinking about how do sacred texts work their way through history, and how in the process they are kind of wrapped up in various regimes of scripturalization, of how they are rendered scriptural over and over and over again. And that, I think, is something that biblical scholars can do, because we're trained to like read texts very carefully and to think about contextualizing them and historicizing them. But we could do that at any part of the spectrum of history in which there has been biblical literature. And I mean, to Richard's question about Kanye, like, yeah, like Kanye and the Bible would be fascinating to think about. Kanye and the forces that shape how he's reading and how he's deploying the Bible in his own work and thinking about his position relative to that. The biblical studies could be about how the Bible works in various complicated assemblages of historical formations that happen at various moments that shape, that are part of shaping the kind of broader stream within which biblical literature flows through global history. I think that doing that kind of work is something biblical scholars can do. And if we just found a way to value it and to turn our attention to it, then it would be a really fruitful way forward.
Well, thank you, Cavan. So I'm going to turn it over with thanks, my thanks to all of you, to Cavan and to Jorn and Richard, but I'm going to turn it over to Daniela to close us out.
Thank you. We are at time. This goes by so fast. Just my thanks to Richard, Jorn, Kelsey, for your wonderful conversation. Congratulations, Cavan. This shit is good. And thank you all for joining us. We will be back in a month with a conversation about Sonia Lee's new book, Temples in the Cliffside, Buddhist Art in Sichuan. Thank you, everyone, and congratulations, Cavan.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you all for being here and for being part of the conversation, and really, really thankful for this conversation. Thank you.